Welcome to Disaster Tales. No more sleep today, boss. No more sleep today, boss. Good morning, or good evening to you, boss. This is your brother Disaster. And today, this is your favorite show, or what's about to become your favorite show, on your favorite digital radio station, or the one that's gonna be your favorite real soon. Here, it's Unbound Horror. Whether it's summer or winter, our winter season never ends. Whether you're listening from the US, the UK, or Canada, it doesn't matter, we're all one family here, boss. Whether you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, you and I are brothers and friends. Even if this is your first time listening, your presence here was meant to be. We all share that spirit of adventure, we're all young wherever horror and adventure find us. And one final piece of advice. If true stories and everything that comes with them scare you, step out, this isn't the place for you. Because here, we buckle up for the fear. Before we turn the volume all the way up. This is Disaster on the Radio, boss. Let's roll. The winter of 1978 in Munich did not just arrive, it occupied the city like an invading army of ghosts, settling over the ancient, cobblestone streets like a wet shroud of heavy, lifeless gray lead and biting, freezing fog. The sub-zero winds whispered through the narrow alleys, sharp and merciless, turning every single human breath into a fragile plume of white smoke that vanished into the bleak, starless night. Down here, in the subterranean art vault buried deep beneath the foundations of the old district, the cold behaved differently. It did not merely bite the exposed skin or numb the stiffening fingers. It sank slowly, deliberately, straight down into the marrow of the bone, heavy and paralyzing. There, it mixed permanently with the relentless, suffocating chemical reek of liquid polyester resin, harsh organic solvents, and scorched paraffin wax. That vile mixture coated the back of the throat like dry ash, thick and metallic, making every single inhalation a calculated, painful struggle. The walls of the expansive, gloomy basement were smeared with thick, uneven layers of whitewashed plaster. They peeled away in jagged, scabby flakes, exposing the weeping, moss-covered brickwork beneath that sweated cold moisture continuously from the frozen earth above. The hour had long since dragged past 3 in the morning. It was a dead, hollow time of night when the city above was entirely silenced, buried under drifts of snow, and the entire world felt shrunk to the suffocating confines of the concrete box I inhabited. I stood completely alone in the absolute darkest corner of the work floor. The heavy shadows clung stubbornly to the fabric of my old wool coat as I stared down into the depths of a deep steel casting vat. Inside it, a thick, viscous resin compound bubbled with a low, sluggish, hypnotic rhythm. Glug. Pop. The chemical soup popped lazily against the surface, releasing thick, acrid plumes of heavy vapor that stung my eyes instantly, blurred my vision, and turned the already stagnant air heavy and thick. The only illumination in the cavernous, tomb-like space came from a series of harsh, flickering yellow floodlamps mounted on overhead iron tracks. They cast blinding, high-contrast cones of harsh light onto the display platforms scattered haphazardly across the scarred, stained floor. And resting upon those raised platforms were the statues. Full-scale human figures, perfectly still and utterly silent. Shaped like men and women frozen mid-gasp in moments of absolute, unadulterated terror. Their surfaces possessed the flawless, unnatural, polished sheen of pure white marble. Capturing every microscopic ridge of human skin, every distended vein on a terrified neck, and every tight contraction of muscle with a terrifying, clinical precision that defied all natural art. Herr Holger, the reclusive, eccentric, and impossibly demanding master sculptor who owned the estate and employed me as his sole assistant, always praised my meticulous work in the casting room. He called me his most reliable set-up hand, trusting me blindly with the delicate, volatile balance of hardeners and toxic polymers. But as I slowly wiped a streak of greasy, foul-smelling solvent across my forehead with the back of a stained leather glove, the pristine perfection of those white figures began to shift in my mind. It stopped feeling like artistic genius. And it started feeling less and less like art, and much more like a warning. A warning written in bone and hardening gum. The heavy silence of the basement pressed down on my eardrums like a heavy underwater current, weighing down my thoughts until they felt sluggish and thick. It was broken only by a single, steady, metronomic sound. The dripping of a condensation pipe somewhere deep in the impenetrable shadows behind the main kiln. Drip. 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 A relentless reminder that the night was seemingly endless. That the exit was 50 long yards of dark, unlit, echoing corridor away. And that the chemicals slowly boiling in the vat were beginning to cool down into a thick, syrupy trap from which there would be no easy escape. The heavy steel wrench in my trembling hand felt slick and greasy with sweat and lingering chemical residue. Its freezing metal handle did nothing at all to settle the cold, nervous knot tightening violently in the pit of my stomach. I turned away slowly from the bubbling, hissing casting vat. My heavy boots crunched softly, rhythmically, over dried flakes of white plaster and hardened chunks of clear resin that littered the scarred, stained concrete floor. The exhausting work of an assistant mold technician down in her Holger's subterranean vault was never clean or easy. But tonight, the atmosphere felt utterly suffocated by a strange, unnatural, heavy tension. A tension that had nothing whatsoever to do with the stinging chemical vapors clouding my vision. Holger had retreated to his private upper studio hours ago. He had locked the heavy, iron-reinforced security door behind him with a sharp, echoing clack. A sound that usually signaled the complete end of my oversight duties for the long night. Yet, instead of packing away my tools, washing my hands, and heading up the long, winding concrete staircase toward the biting, freezing Munich air, I found myself drawn backward. Drifting step by step toward the dark, recessed corner of the back work table. The one single area in the entire vault that Holger always kept strictly, aggressively off limits during all of my shifts. I wiped my stained, chemical-burned hands down the front of my heavy canvas apron. I approached the massive, scarred oak workbench cautiously. Its cluttered surface was littered with discarded copper wire, torn rubber gaskets, and half-empty tins of industrial mold release agent. Beneath the main sliding panel of the desk, a small, rusted iron drawer remained permanently shut. Its keyhole looked dark, empty, and forbidding. For months, I had strictly respected that invisible boundary. I had always assumed it merely held proprietary chemical formulas, trade secrets, or expensive master blueprints for Holger's internationally acclaimed statues. But tonight, the relentless, rhythmic dripping of the condensation pipe overhead, and the distant, mournful howling of the wind outside the deep basement ventilation grates, created an unsettling, almost hypnotic soundtrack that urged me to look closer. To push past the rules. I crouched down low on the freezing floor, running my fingers carefully along the rough underside of the wooden framing. Until my fingertips suddenly brushed against a small, cold, metallic object. Wedged neatly into a hidden, carved groove directly behind the left support leg. I pulled my hand back slowly. It was a small, surprisingly heavy brass key. Coated entirely in a fine, undisturbed layer of gray dust. My heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm directly against my ribs. Thump. 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 I pulled the key free from its hiding spot and rose unsteadily to my feet. I glanced nervously over my shoulder toward the distant, pitch-black stairwell. Just to ensure the heavy upper door remained firmly shut. The harsh, jaundiced glare of the overhead floodlamps beat down mercilessly on the back of my neck. Sweat trickled down my spine as I inserted the cold brass key into the rusted, stiff lock of the drawer. It turned with a dry, metallic click. A sound that echoed through the empty basement, feeling entirely too loud and exposed in the dead silence of the vault. I held my breath. I pulled the heavy drawer open very slowly, bracing myself mentally for whatever trade secrets or financial records Holger had kept locked away from the curious eyes of the world. Utterly unaware, and completely unprepared for the reality that awaited me in the dark. Unaware that the contents resting silently inside that hidden space would instantly shatter every fragile illusion I had ever held about the brilliant genius of the master sculptor, and drag me headfirst, screaming in the dark, into a living nightmare of flesh and hardening polymer. The hidden drawer slid open on dry, ungreased wooden runners. With a soft, protesting scrape that echoed through the empty expanse of the subterranean vault like a sudden gunshot, shattering the fragile quiet of the dead night. I held my breath completely. My trembling fingers rested lightly on the cold brass handle as I leaned forward, eager, yet utterly terrified, to inspect the contents hidden away in the deep, shadowed interior of that forbidden space. There were no secret chemical formulas, no master blueprints, no expensive receipts for imported Italian marble. Instead, the drawer was packed tight, stuffed to the brim with a series of heavy, weathered, leather-bound medical record files. Each one was stamped with official police department seals and municipal archive stamps from various districts across Munich, dated continuously throughout the past year, marking a trail of disappearances hidden in plain sight. My shaking fingers reached inside, and I pulled the topmost file free from the stack. The heavy cardboard cover felt strangely cold, wet, and clammy against my skin, like the flesh of a freshly unearthed corpse. I flicked the cover open under the harsh, jaundiced glare of the yellow overhead flood lamp, revealing a grim collection of clipped police bulletins, missing person reports, and stark, high-contrast black and white photographs. Pictures of young men and women who had vanished without a single trace from the snowy streets of the city over the preceding months. Their faces stared back up at me, with wide, haunting expressions of raw vulnerability, completely stripped of the heroic, idealized permanence that Holger's white resin statues immortalized upstairs. Beneath the paper files sat a collection of heavier, far more disturbing items. Things that made the blood run instantly cold in my veins, freezing every drop of courage I had left in my body. A neat row of professional-grade surgical scalpels rested securely inside a black velvet-lined steel case, their thin, cruel blades gleaming with a dull, menacing edge under the yellow light. Next to them lay several rubber-stoppered glass vials, filled entirely with a clear, thick, viscous liquid, accompanied by printed pharmaceutical labels identifying the contents as a potent, synthetic muscle relaxant, a substance capable of inducing complete, flaccid paralysis within seconds, while leaving the central nervous system entirely conscious, awake, and acutely aware of every single external stimulus. Aware. Trapped. At the very bottom of the hidden drawer rested a stack of recent Polaroid photographs, their glossy surfaces still crisp, fresh, and slightly warm to the touch. I picked them up with a shaking, uncooperative hand, turning them over one by one, and I felt the very last remaining anchor of my fragile reality tear completely away. The images depicted living human victims, some of them heartbreakingly recognizable from the missing person bulletin spread across the desk, tightly bound with thick hemp ropes and industrial restraints, sitting helplessly, eyes wide with unspeakable terror, inside the very same deep steel casting vats that filled the dark corners of the workshop. The horrifying puzzle pieces clicked together in my mind with terrifying, nauseating speed, shattering the illusion of Holger's artistic genius in a single, sickening revelation. He was not carving marble out of raw stone. He was hunting his subjects off the dark, freezing streets of Munich. injecting them with his paralyzing agents to lock their terrified, screaming expressions in place for eternity, and lowering them alive into the vats, to be slowly encased, layer by suffocating layer, in liquid polymer. They were not statues at all. They were breathing, feeling human beings, transformed into permanent, agonizing monuments of suffering. And the terrifying realization settled over my shoulders like a physical, crushing weight, freezing me in place, as I heard the heavy upper iron door, slowly, deliberately, begin to unlatch in the dark, dead silence above. The sudden, piercing, ear-splitting scrape of the heavy iron security door unlatching at the very top of the subterranean stone staircase hit my eardrums like a live round fired point-blank in an enclosed, concrete room. It froze the warm blood instantly in my veins, locking every single muscle, tendon, and fiber in my body into an absolute, suffocating, paralyzing stillness. The incriminating Polaroid photographs fluttered helplessly from my trembling, sweat-slicked fingertips, scattering wildly across the scarred, dusty wooden surface of the workbench like falling autumn leaves of doom. As the horrifying, nauseating reality of my discovery crashed down upon me with a crushing, breath-stealing force that nearly buckled my knees. Holger was coming down. The man I had served as a loyal, unquestioning, deeply admiring assistant for the past grueling, endless year was not a master of classical, timeless sculpture at all. He was a cold, calculated, methodical predator. A remorseless monster who had slyly, brilliantly used my own innocent, unwitting hands to mix the chemical graves of his human victims. Panic, sharp, electric, blinding, and frantic, surged violently through my chest, screaming at the core of my reeling mind to run, to hide, to find any conceivable exit from this subterranean concrete tomb before those slow, deliberate footsteps began their inevitable, crushing descent down the stone steps. I whipped around frantically from the desk, my wild, bloodshot eyes darting desperately across the dimly lit expanse of the vast workshop, searching desperately for a secondary route of escape. The main entrance was completely blocked by the winding staircase, where Holger's heavy leather boots were already beginning to echo with a steady, metronomic, inescapable cadence. The far walls were solid, unyielding, ancient stone, buried feet beneath the frozen, indifferent Munich earth. My stumbling boots caught hard against the jagged edge of a stray, empty steel casting vat resting near the base of the workbench, sending the heavy metal basin tipping over with a deafening, echoing, metallic crash. A violent, shattering sound that reverberated mercilessly through the vaulted ceiling and shattered the oppressive silence of the vault in a single, catastrophic blow. Clang! Instantly, the slow footsteps on the stairs stopped dead. A heavy, suffocating, breathless stillness flooded the basement, broken only by the sluggish, obscene, bubbling hiss of the resin vat in the dark corner, and the frantic, deafening, hammering rhythm of my own heart threatening to burst right through my ribs. I stood completely frozen in the harsh, pitiless glare of the yellow overhead floodlamps, my hands still coated in the greasy, foul, chemical-burned residue of industrial solvents, utterly trapped in the dead center of the room, like a cornered, terrified animal caught hopelessly in a trap of its own making. From the pitch-black, shadowed mouth of the staircase, a low, smooth, cultured voice cut sharply through the heavy, poisoned air, completely devoid of sudden anger or rage, yet laced with a chilling, clinical, terrifying calm that made my stomach turn completely inside out. "You always were far too thorough with your cleanup, Albert." Holger murmured the words softly from the dark, his footsteps resuming with a slow, agonizing, deliberate pace, as he stepped out smoothly from the impenetrable shadows and into the blinding, jaundiced light, his pale, dead eyes fixed dead on mine, with the cold, unblinking, analytical focus of a meticulous collector inspecting a newly acquired, highly prized specimen. The heavy, measured, relentless cadence of Holger's boots hitting the cold concrete floor echoed like a distant death knell across the open, hollow expanse of the subterranean vault. Each heavy step brought the tall, immaculately dressed man closer and closer to the harsh perimeter of light where I stood entirely paralyzed by fear. He did not rush his pace, nor did he raise his voice in sudden anger. His absolute composure carried the terrifying, suffocating authority of an apex predator who knew the iron boundaries of his private cage were absolute and inescapable. As he stepped fully into the harsh, jaundiced cone of the overhead floodlamps, the stark illumination caught the silver glint of a surgical scalpel tucked neatly into the breast pocket of his charcoal wool vest. And the faint, permanent smirk of detached, sadistic amusement playing across his pale, thin lips. Curiosity has ruined far more fine careers than incompetence ever did, Albert, Holger said softly, his words gliding effortlessly through the poisoned air. His hands slid smoothly into his trouser pockets as he paused just 10 feet away from the ruined workbench where the scattered Polaroid photographs and confidential medical files lay exposed to the heavy air. His cold gaze flicked down briefly toward the open drawer, then tracked back up to meet my terrified eyes. Registering no surprise whatsoever. Only a mild, clinical disappointment, as if a favorite, expensive laboratory tool had suddenly cracked under unnecessary pressure. For months, your technical execution with the polymer catalysts has been utterly exemplary. You understood the exact, microscopic ratios of hardener to resin, the precise heat thresholds needed to prevent premature surface cracking. It would be a profound, unforgivable waste to discard such rare talent over a simple, childish failure of discretion. Every single muscle in my trembling body coiled tight like a rusted spring. My fingers flexing involuntarily against the stiff seams of my canvas apron as my racing mind clawed desperately through the impossibly narrow margins of survival. There was no reasoning with a madman who looked at breathing, bleeding human beings and saw only raw construction materials for permanent art. I didn't waste a single breath attempting to answer him. Instead, my eyes locked desperately onto the heavy iron pipe propped against the base of the nearest support pillar, 6 feet away to my left. Calculating the explosive, suicidal burst of speed it would take to reach it before he closed the distance between us. Holger must have read the sudden, microscopic shift in my posture. The subtle drop of my shoulders, the hard clenching of my jaw, and the desperate twitch of my feet. Because his own relaxed demeanor vanished in a fraction of a second. Replaced by a sudden, chilling, dangerous efficiency. I honestly wouldn't advise that, Albert, Holger murmured, his voice dropping a full octave as a cold shudder ran down my spine. As a pair of massive, broad-shouldered figures, silent, towering men I had never seen before during my shifts, likely local thugs recruited for heavy lifting and discreet transport, stepped silently out of the deep, impenetrable shadows behind the main kiln. Their heavy boots scraping against the stone floor like the claws of beasts closing in on their prey. Instantly cutting off my only remaining path toward the rear utility corridor. Before I could pivot, scream, or lunge toward the iron pipe, the two men closed the gap with terrifying, athletic speed. Their heavy, calloused hands clamped down over my arms like industrial vices. Wrenching my wrists backward with brutal, bone-crushing force and dragging me hard, face first, against the scarred, freezing concrete floor. The rough, jagged, unforgiving concrete scraped raw and bleeding against my burning, tear-streaked cheek as the two heavy-set men pinned me completely flat and helpless to the freezing, dust-choked floor of the subterranean vault. Their thick, heavy-soled leather boots pressing brutally, mercilessly, and with crushing weight down against my ankles and wrists to lock every single twitch of desperate, fleeing movement. The bitter, metallic taste of warm, copper-rich blood flooded my mouth where my teeth had accidentally clipped my inner lip during the sudden, violent, and jarring tackle. But the intense physical pain of the impact was entirely swallowed, eclipsed, and forgotten by the blinding, suffocating wave of pure panic clawing relentlessly at my throat. I thrashed wildly and violently beneath their crushing, immovable grip, twisting my torso and kicking my legs in a frantic, hopeless bid for leverage against the unyielding stone. But their combined weight felt like a massive slab of solid granite anchored directly to my spine, crushing the very breath from my lungs and pinning me to the earth like an insect under glass. My mind raced through 1,000 desperate scenarios, grasping at any shred of hope, any hidden escape route, or any miracle that might wrench me from this nightmare. Yet the cold reality of the concrete beneath me remained my only immediate truth. From directly above me, through a blur of sweat, tears, and rising terror, Holger stepped slowly and deliberately into my narrow line of sight. His immaculate, polished leather shoes stopping just inches from my terrified, staring face. He didn't look angry in the slightest, his expression remained chillingly placid, the face of a meticulous craftsman observing a stubborn piece of raw material that refused to settle into the mold. He crouched down slowly on one knee, the crisp fabric of his fine wool trousers rustling softly as he reached deep into the pocket of his charcoal vest. And pulled out a small, glass-stoppered vial filled with the clear, thick, viscous liquid I had seen earlier locked away in the bottom desk drawer. The faint glint of the laboratory lights caught the curved glass surface, refracting tiny pinpricks of yellow illumination that danced mockingly across his fingers. "Save your energy, Albert," Holger murmured, his voice smooth, calm, melodic, and entirely devoid of any haste as he popped the glass stopper with a sharp flick of his thumb, releasing a faint, sharp, medicinal odor into the stagnant air. Struggling only accelerates the heart rate, and an accelerated heart rate complicates the initial preservation phase. We require the vascular system to remain calm, even as the autonomic functions begin to shut down. I tried to scream, to twist my head away, but one of the men clamped a massive, calloused hand over my jaw with bone-crushing strength. Forcing my mouth open while the other drove a knee hard into the center of my back, squeezing the remaining air straight out of my lungs in a sharp, painful wheeze. Holger didn't hesitate for a single second as he prepared the instrument of my doom. He inverted the small glass vial, drew a precise, measured dose into a sterile medical syringe with practiced, effortless ease, and leaned down beside my ear, his breath cold against my skin. "Consider this your final lesson in the chemistry of permanence," Holger whispered softly, pressing the thin steel needle deep into the side of my neck just beneath the jawline. A sudden, freezing wave of numbness rushed instantly through my veins, shooting down my neck and shoulders like liquid ice before flooding my chest and limbs. The frantic thrashing of my arms and legs slowed abruptly, stuttering against the concrete as every muscle in my body surrendered to a heavy, leaden paralysis. Within 3 terrifying seconds, my vocal cords locked tight, my lungs refused to expand, and the world began to fade into a silent, frozen tunnel where my mind remained desperately, screamingly awake while my physical form turned to stone. The heavy chemical paralysis did not arrive like a sudden, merciful blow to the head, it rolled over my central nervous system in a slow, suffocating, viscous tide that locked every single fiber of my being into absolute, unyielding stillness. I could still feel the gritty, unforgiving texture of the cold concrete scraping against my burning, tear-streaked cheek, could still register the microscopic prick of the empty glass syringe rolling away across the dusty floor. But my limbs belonged to someone else now. They were dead weights of solid lead and heavy stone, utterly unresponsive to the frantic, screaming commands my terrified brain hurled down the paralyzed spinal cord. Holger stood up slowly, dusting off his immaculate trousers with the casual, chilling indifference of a man brushing off an insignificant speck of lint after inspecting a completed piece of masonry. He nodded once to the 2 heavy-set laborers pinning my torso to the floor, and without a single wasted motion, they seized my paralyzed frame by the shoulders and the ankles, lifting me effortlessly off the ground. The transition from the freezing concrete into the open, heavy air felt strangely weightless, my body dangling stiff and rigid like a felled timber as they carried me across the cavernous expanse of the subterranean vault toward the center of the room. Overhead, the harsh yellow flood lamps hummed with a monotonous, maddening drone, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling plaster walls where the other pale white statues stood in eternal, silent observation. My eyes, the only parts of my anatomy still under my conscious control, strained upward, tracking the vast iron framework of the ceiling as we approached the deepest, hottest corner of the workshop. There sat the massive, double-walled steel casting vat I had spent the earlier hours of the night prepping, its internal heating elements glowing a dull, angry red through the lower ventilation grates while the thick, viscous polymer compound bubbled with a sluggish, rhythmic pulse that threw thick plumes of acrid chemical vapor into the stagnant air. The heat radiating off the metal basin was immense, washing over my frozen skin like the breath of an open furnace, carrying that familiar, nauseating reek of synthetic hardeners, organic solvents, and scorched wax that now promised to become my final resting place. Holger walked ahead of the two men, reaching out with one slender hand to adjust the brass valve on a secondary overhead hoist rigged directly above the vat, his movements entirely unhurried, as if he were merely preparing a workstation for a routine morning tutorial rather than orchestrating an execution in the dead of night. He tested the tension of the steel chain links, listened to the smooth, oiled clicking of the overhead pulley system, and then turned back to face my rigid, helpless form with a gaze of pure, clinical satisfaction. They hoisted me up by a webbed canvas sling they had quickly strapped beneath my arms, the rough fabric biting into my chest as the pulley began to crank upward with a slow, grinding mechanical whine that set my teeth on edge. Suspended 6 feet in the air above the bubbling, amber-tinted syrup of the resin vat, I stared down into the boiling depths, watching the thick surface tension break and reform in slow motion, trapped inside a living nightmare where every terrifying second stretched out into an eternity of helpless, unblinking horror. The mechanical, high-pitched screech of the overhead pulley system turning on its rusted iron axle cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the subterranean vault like a dull saw blade, vibrating straight down through the taut canvas sling that supported my rigid, paralyzed frame. Suspended 6 feet above the gaping mouth of the deep steel casting vat, I hung motionless in the damp, heavy air, my eyes locked in a wide, unblinking stare upon the churning, viscous surface of the amber-tinted polymer below. The heat radiating off the concealed heating elements at the base of the basin was completely suffocating, wrapping around my exposed face and hands like the oppressive breath of an open industrial kiln, forcing the remaining air out of my throat in dry, silent gasps that my locked diaphragm refused to properly form. Holger stood at the edge of the metal platform with one hand resting casually on the polished brass control wheel of the lower intake valve, his expression entirely devoid of petty malice, wearing instead the quiet, concentrated focus of an artisan about to apply the final, delicate glaze to a masterwork. He did not look at me as a human victim or a desperate enemy. To his clinical mind, I was simply an essential component of the evening's grotesque composition, the final missing piece required to complete the silent gallery standing motionless in the shadows around us. With a slow, deliberate twist of his slender wrist, Holger turned the brass valve counterclockwise, and the sharp hiss of pressurized rubber hoses filled the room as the secondary feed line sprang to life. A thick, syrupy stream of preheated liquid polyester resin began to pour from the overhead copper nozzle, striking the exact center of the deep steel basin with a heavy, wet thud before spreading outward in expanding, concentric ripples. The pungent chemical reek intensified 100-fold, instantly crowding out the remaining clean air in my lungs with an overwhelming concentration of organic solvents, formaldehyde, and sweet, burning wax that made my eyes burn behind my unblinking eyelids. Holger adjusted the flow rate with microscopic precision, keeping the stream steady and controlled, ensuring that the rising level of the resin would accumulate gradually rather than rushing in a violent, destructive wave. He wanted the transition to be calculated, measured, and structurally sound, giving the chemical compound ample opportunity to infiltrate every fold of my canvas apron and settle evenly against the contours of my boots before creeping upward toward my chest. Slowly, agonizingly, the level of the viscous, glowing liquid inside the vat began to rise. As the pulley chain was lowered by a fraction of a foot under Holger's careful guidance, my dangling boots made their initial contact with the surface of the boiling polymer mixture. The sensation was immediate and searing, a fierce, localized wave of intense heat that shot straight up through the soles of my shoes and the leather of my heels, though my paralyzed nervous system struggled to translate the full scale of the agony past the heavy blockade of the synthetic muscle relaxant. Still, I could feel the dense, heavy weight of the liquid pressing against my ankles, grabbing hold of the fabric of my trousers with a viscous suction that seemed determined to anchor me permanently to the bottom of the basin. The resin was warm at first, then aggressively hot as it mixed with the active hardeners being pumped in from the secondary line, transitioning from a fluid state into a thick, adhesive gel that wrapped around my shins like molten lead. My mind screamed at my legs to kick, to pull away, to thrash against the rising tide of chemical death, but my muscles remained locked in their icy, unyielding prison, betraying every instinct of survival as the bronze-tinted fluid crept steadily past my knees and began to lap hungrily against the lower buttons of my canvas work apron. The creeping tide of the warm, amber-tinted polymer continued its slow, mechanical, and unforgiving ascent up the entire length of my paralyzed frame, consuming my thighs and waist with a heavy, suffocating pressure that felt like being slowly swallowed alive by the earth itself. The rough canvas sling bit deeper and deeper into my armpits as the overhead pulley mechanism was manually lowered another fraction of an inch by Holger, bringing my chest dangerously closer to the boiling surface of the vat with an agonizing, deliberate cadence. The intense heat radiating off the chemical compound was no longer just a dry, blistering wave, it was a physical, crushing weight that pressed down hard against my ribs, turning the air trapped inside my lungs into a scorching vapor that burned the lining of my throat with every micro-inhalation. My unblinking eyes remained fixed upward, tracking the hypnotic, swirling patterns of iridescent light cast across the vaulted stone ceiling by the harsh yellow flood lamps, while my mind spun in a frantic, isolated loop of silent terror. I could feel the thick, viscous resin soaking heavily through the heavy denim of my trousers and the thick cotton of my shirt, its temperature steadily mounting as the exothermic chemical reaction between the base polymer and the hardeners accelerated inside the confined steel basin. Holger stepped closer to the edge of the casting platform, holding a heavy steel clipboard in one hand while using a long-handled wooden paddle to gently guide the rising fluid around my torso, ensuring that no air pockets formed against the fabric of my clothes to compromise the structural integrity of the final cast. His movements were clinical, detached, and utterly devoid of human empathy, mirroring the meticulous care an archivist might take when cataloging a fragile, centuries-old manuscript. Notice how the resin settles into the natural contours of the musculature, Albert, Holger remarked quietly, his voice carrying an eerie, instructional tone across the echoing vault as if we were still conducting a routine midday workshop review rather than an execution. The exact viscosity we mixed earlier ensures that the material does not run too fast, allowing it to capture every microscopic nuance of tension in the chest wall before the hardening phase begins. It is a profound pity you will not be around to witness the final polish, but your contribution to the gallery's structural symmetry will endure indefinitely. As if responding to his clinical assessment, the rising level of the resin crossed the lower line of my ribcage and began to press heavily against my chest, immediately restricting what little shallow breathing I could manage through my paralyzed diaphragm. The immense hydrostatic pressure of the dense fluid squeezed my torso from all sides, making it feel as though an iron band were tightening around my lungs with every passing second. The chemical reek grew blindingly intense, burning the back of my nasal passages and coating my tongue in a bitter, metallic film of unreacted styrene and hardener vapor. Inch by inch, the warm, glowing amber liquid crept past my sternum, swallowed the pockets of my canvas apron, and reached the level of my shoulders, enveloping my arms in a tight, inescapable grip that fused my limbs to my sides like concrete anchors. My chin remained tilted slightly upward, the only part of my body still hovering above the dangerous boundary of the surface, staring out across the shadowed expanse of the subterranean workshop where the other silent, white resin statues stood frozen in their eternal poses of agony, mocking my impending fate as the heavy, syrupy tide inched closer and closer to my lower lip. The bitter, Suffocating reek of unreacted styrene and scorched paraffin wax coated the back of my throat like dry ash as the amber tide finally crept past my collarbone and brushed against the lower edge of my jaw. The immense hydrostatic pressure of the dense, heated polymer compound wrapped tightly around my neck, squeezing my windpipe with an unyielding, crushing grip that instantly extinguished the last remaining traces of shallow air I had managed to drag into my lungs. My chest was completely immobilized now, fused into a solid, heavy block of hardening resin that radiated a deep, agonizing heat straight through my ribs and into my spine. Every nerve ending in my torso screamed in silent agony beneath the heavy blanket of the paralytic agent, but my limbs remained locked in absolute, icy stillness, powerless to twitch or struggle against the chemical grave rising steadily around my throat. The weight of the liquid felt alive, a sentient parasite wrapping its thick, syrupy tentacles around my frame and pulling me down into an abyss of its own making. Every millimeter of upward travel brought a fresh wave of thermal intensity, cooking the skin beneath my clothes and turning my blood into a sluggish, boiling sludge that pounded against my temples with deafening force. My brain fought a desperate, futile war against the chemical shackles of the drug, screaming commands to muscles that refused to twitch, demanding lungs to expand when there was nothing left to inhale save for the toxic vapor of my own undoing. Holger stepped back from the edge of the steel casting vat, his tall, immaculate figure casting a long, skeletal shadow across the scarred concrete floor under the harsh glare of the overhead yellow floodlamps. He reached down and picked up a heavy, long-handled wooden scraper, using it with meticulous care to smooth down a stray bubble of polymer that had formed near the rim of the basin, ensuring the surface finish remained pristine and flawless before the final curing stage commenced. His movements were unhurried, executed with the cold, artistic precision of a master craftsman putting the finishing touches on a commissioned bust, entirely detached from the living human consciousness trapped beneath the hardening synthetic skin. He inspected his reflection in the polished, curved rim of the metal basin with an air of profound satisfaction, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine shirt as if he had just finished spending an afternoon restoring a damaged canvas in a high-class gallery. There was no tremor in his fingers, no hurried breath of exertion, only the quiet, rhythmic composure of a man who viewed human life as nothing more than raw clay waiting to be shaped into a permanent monument of his own distorted genius. Across the cavernous expanse of the subterranean vault, the silent rows of white human statues stood bathed in the sickly yellow glow, their frozen expressions of terror and agony seeming to shift slightly in the dancing shadows as if welcoming a new member into their eternal, unmoving gallery. The rhythmic, metronomic dripping of the distant condensation pipe echoed through the vaulted stone ceiling, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time in a world where my own heartbeat had become the only internal clock left ticking. My unblinking eyes remained fixed upward, staring directly at the harsh glare of the central flood lamp as the amber liquid slowly rose another fraction of an inch, kissing the corners of my mouth and pressing heavily against my lower lip with a warm, viscous suction that signaled the beginning of the end. The silence between the dripping pipe and the low hum of the heating elements felt heavier than lead, pressing down upon the room like a physical vault door sliding shut on the last fragments of the outside world. I could feel the faint, desperate flutter of my pulse slowing down beneath the onslaught of the paralyzing agent, each beat fainter and more distant than the last, echoing inside my skull like a drum being beaten underwater. With a slow, deliberate motion, Holger turned off the main overhead flood lamps one by one, plunging the vast majority of the basement into a thick, suffocating darkness that swallowed the distant corners and the silent statues alike. Only a single, dim yellow bulb remained lit above the casting vat, casting a weak, jaundiced halo over my face as the resin level finally rose past my nose, blocking out the last remaining pocket of air in the universe. The warm, thick polymer flooded my mouth and surged up into my nostrils, sealing my respiratory tract in an absolute, airtight embrace that immediately choked off consciousness, leaving me suspended in a timeless, dark void where my final, silent scream echoed endlessly against the walls of my own frozen mind, boss. The transition from suffocating consciousness into the absolute, timeless black of the hardened polymer was not a clean break, but a slow, agonizing descent through layers of fading perception where time lost all linear meaning. Submerged completely beneath the thick, amber-tinted resin, my mind continued to race in frantic, trapped circles long after my lungs had ceased their desperate demands for oxygen. Every sensory detail of the subterranean vault, the acrid, chemical reek of styrene eating into my nasal passages, the heavy, blistering heat radiating from the steel walls of the casting vat, and the distant, metronomic dripping of the condensation pipe echoing through the vaulted stone ceiling, remained vividly etched inside my skull, magnified 100-fold in the terrifying clarity of sensory deprivation. In that frozen eternity of darkness, the boundary between reality and hallucination dissolved completely. I was no longer a young man pinned inside a steel vat in a forgotten Munich basement. I was a permanent ghost trapped behind a polished, flawless wall of synthetic marble, doomed to bear witness to the quiet atrocities unfolding in the world I had left behind. My unblinking eyes, fixed forever in the upward gaze of final terror, stared blindly into the amber suspension that had hardened around my lashes and brows into an impenetrable amber mask. Above the surface of my new, artificial shell, the muted sounds of the workshop drifted down through the dense liquid medium like echoes from another dimension. I could hear the soft, rhythmic scrape of Holger's polished leather shoes moving across the scarred concrete floor as he performed his final inspection of the night. There was no rush in his steps, no hurried panic of a murderer hiding his tracks, only the serene, methodical pacing of an obsessed curator tending to his private gallery. I felt the faint, dull vibration of his hand resting briefly against the exterior wall of the steel vat, a proprietary, almost affectionate touch, as a master carpenter might run his palm over the smooth grain of a newly finished mahogany table to check for rough spots or structural flaws. Magnificent, Holger murmured softly to the empty room, his voice carrying an unnatural, resonant clarity through the dense medium encasing my ears. The polymerization curve stabilized precisely at 38 degrees Celsius. No surface cracking, no internal microbubbles, and the facial tension captured at the moment of occlusion is absolute perfection. You always did possess an exceptional eye for structural preparation, Albert, even if your discretion ultimately proved inadequate to the demands of your station. A soft, rustling sound followed his words as he adjusted the heavy wool fabric of his coat, preparing to extinguish the single remaining yellow work lamp and abandon the basement to the freezing Munich winter. The click of the final wall switch echoed like a pistol shot through the dead silence of the vault, plunging the vast, subterranean chamber into an impenetrable, velvety blackness that matched the eternal night closing in around my own consciousness. Yet, even as the darkness solidified and the external sounds faded away into a low, muffled hum, my mind refused to extinguish itself entirely. Trapped inside the amber casing, suspended shoulder-deep alongside the silent rows of earlier victims whose frozen, terrified faces lined the dark walls of the gallery, I was forced to confront the true horror of my legacy. I had spent months mixing the very chemicals that now served as my tomb, had polished the very surfaces that now mocked my agony, and had trusted a predator who viewed human flesh as nothing more than raw, malleable clay waiting to be molded into eternal silence. The weight of the hardened polymer pressing against my chest was immense, a heavy, unyielding shroud of synthetic stone that held my frozen frame in a perpetual state of helpless anticipation. The air in my lungs was long gone, replaced by a cold, heavy numbness that slowly crept inward from my extremities toward my core, dulling the frantic panic of my thoughts into a deep, numbing ache. But beneath that physical decay, the raw defiance of my consciousness remained stubbornly, painfully awake, screaming a silent, unending curse into the dark, waiting for whatever final judgment the master sculptor had prepared for his collection when the morning light finally broke over the frozen streets of the city above, Boss. The passage of time lost all conventional measure down in the pitch-black vault beneath frozen Munich, transforming hours into agonizing centuries as my mind remained locked inside the amber tomb of hardened synthetic resin. There was no sunrise, no shifting light through the barred vents, only the suffocating stillness of a crypt where air had ceased to exist, and the only sound was the distant dripping of a pipe echoing through damp stone. Suspended upright within the steel casting vat, my rigid body served as the newest permanent fixture in Holger's grotesque gallery, standing shoulder to shoulder with the silent rows of victims who had vanished before me, their unblinking eyes staring into the dark. My mind, stripped of physical agency yet cursed with an unnerving awareness, drifted across memory and nightmare, replaying every step of the descent that brought me here. I remembered the cold bite of winter wind, the stinging reek of organic solvents and styrene, and the fatal curiosity that drove me to turn the brass key in the hidden desk drawer. I had believed myself a trusted technician helping to shape classical art, failing to realize until too late that the master sculptor's genius was built upon human slaughter, and my own hands had mixed the compounds that sealed my fate. The regret burned hotter than the exothermic heat of the polymer that had cooked my skin, a bitter fire raging inside a brain cut off from the world. Above the polished surface, the heavy iron door leading to the main building unlatched with a sharp scrape that shattered the silence. Heavy footsteps echoed down the stone staircase, slow and measured, carrying the cadence of the master craftsman returning to inspect his harvest. A beam of yellow light cut through the gloom as Holger switched on the overhead flood lamps, casting a blinding illumination across the white resin statues and the deep vat where I stood entombed. I felt the dull vibration of his boots approaching the platform, stopping just inches from the outer rim of the basin. For a long time, there was absolute silence, save for the steady hum of fixtures and the dripping water. Holger did not speak immediately. I could sense his presence hovering just beyond my vision, a tall silhouette standing in contemplation of his latest masterpiece. When his voice finally broke the silence, it was soft, conversational, and devoid of remorse. "Magnificent," Holger whispered, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat against the cold metal rim. "The curing process is entirely complete. The structural density is uniform, and the surface finish has achieved that pristine luminosity we strive for. You always possessed an exceptional touch for the chemical ratios, Albert, ensuring the hardeners bonded without a microfracture. It is a profound pity you cannot step outside the mold to admire your final contribution to the gallery." A soft rustle of fabric marked his movement as he turned away from the vat, walking down the central aisle to inspect the older statues, running a gloved hand over the terror-stricken face of a victim who had vanished months prior. His footsteps faded toward the far workbench where police bulletins, medical files, and surgical tools remained locked away from the world, safely hidden from any future assistant. "Every great collection requires a foundation," Holger called out over his shoulder, his voice echoing smoothly off the whitewashed walls. "Art demands sacrifice, Albert. It requires stripping away chaotic human frailties, fear, doubt, decay, and replacing them with eternal permanence. You are no longer merely a servant of the process, you are the process itself. Immortal, unyielding, and silent." His footsteps returned, pausing at the base of the staircase before the heavy iron door swung open to admit the cold draft of the Munich morning. A whisper of wind drifted down the concrete steps, carrying the distant chime of a city clock tower striking an hour I would never see, before the heavy door slammed shut with an echoing thud that locked the vault away from the living forever. As the echoes died into silence, the single overhead lamp flickered and died, plunging the chamber back into velvety darkness. Yet, trapped deep within my synthetic tomb, surrounded by the silent congregation of the dead, my consciousness remained defiantly awake, condemned to bear witness to an endless night where no rescue would come, and where my final, silent scream would echo forever against the cold stone walls of my eternal prison.